Hello, my friends. So today, I wanted to talk about one of the most common cliche explanations for why people are racist, or really any other so-called prejudicial opinion. This most common explanation, at least that I've come across, is essentially the idea that ignorance causes fear, and fear causes hatred, and then that's often followed up with the idea that hatred then causes violence. So, of course, the idea is that racist people are just ignorant of other races. They lack any experience or knowledge of other races. And that lack of knowledge causes them to fear them. And then that fear generates hatred of them. And the way I see it, as I was thinking about this, there's a problem at every step of the way. There's an issue with every single step in this equation. And I will go through each step and sort of explain to you why it's nonsense at every single step. But the first thing I wanted to mention is how old this cliche is. If you search on Google for ignorance causes fear and fear causes hatred, you could find quotes that go all the way back to 11th century Islamic philosophers like Ibn Rushdi, and it's expressed by people like Michael Moore these days, the famous liberal documentary producer. It's expressed even in like Star Wars. You'll find like quotes from Yoda saying shit like this. And this cliche is, I came across it when someone showed me a TED Talk of this black guy who became friends with a Ku Klux Klan member, and through their friendship, he was able to get the Ku Klux Klan leader to retire and give up his evil racist ways. And so this kind of cliche is an idea, an explanation for why racism occurs, that is held in common between both the pseudo-intellectuals of liberalism as well as the common, everyday, left-leaning person. It's very easily digested and then repeated by the average, everyday person, and it somehow really hits home for them. And, I said that this quote goes back to Ibn Rushdi, but it goes back even farther than that. The idea that ignorance, a lack of knowledge, is what causes evil in general, is an idea that goes back as far as Plato and beyond, since Plato got a lot of his ideas from the Pythagoreans. The Pythagoreans were heavily influenced by Judaic mysticism. This is an old idea that a lack of knowledge causes evil. And, I mean, Plato used this kind of idea to justify his whole philosopher king setup, because he argued that if philosophers were the absolute rulers of a state, then there could be no evil, because the philosophers have the best knowledge, and having the most knowledge, having absolute knowledge, if you were a true philosopher, would mean that it would be impossible to be evil, because evil, under Plato's whole philosophy, is caused by the lack of knowledge. So if you don't lack for any knowledge, then you can't be evil. And I'll come back to that idea in a few minutes as I wrap this video up, because I think that idea that people are only evil if they lack some knowledge is profoundly appealing to certain types of people. But let me talk about each step in this equation. The beginning is ignorance breeds fear. That is not only not necessarily true, I mean, it could be true for certain people, but for white people, for European descendant people, and Europeans themselves, ignorance, a lack of knowledge, has generally inspired a sense of wonderment and curiosity and a desire to overcome that and to obtain whatever knowledge you recognize yourself, whatever knowledge you recognize is lacking in yourself. So this idea goes back, if you want to keep hearkening back to the ancient Greeks, this idea goes back to Aristotle, where Aristotle said the root cause of philosophy is the sense of wonderment that comes from recognizing your lack of knowledge. When you look out at the world and you look at the stars or you look at nature in general, you see things that you don't understand, that you can't explain. And that generates a sense of wonder, a sense of awe-struck curiosity, and a desire to be able to understand, to be able to explain. So the idea that ignorance leads to fear is really the opposite. Ignorance typically leads to curiosity in white people, in European people, that I know of. This is my general experience in the world. And the next step, fear leading to hatred. Fear does not necessarily lead to hatred. I think often fear leads to a desire to get away, not to just hate. Hate means like to have a serious negative appraisal or a negative evaluation of something to the point where you want to destroy it. I think that is a natural connotation to hatred, is the desire to destroy something, the desire to harm something. When you really hate someone or you hate something, you want to hurt it. But fear does not necessarily lead to hatred. I'm afraid, if I were out in the woods, I would be afraid of a grizzly bear. If I were in the right area, of course. But seeing a grizzly bear in the woods and being afraid of it does not necessarily mean that I want to go and hunt it down and kill it or harm it in any way. Typically, it just means that I want to get away from it. I want to avoid it. And avoiding something, fearing something, does not mean you hate it. I would defend myself if the grizzly bear attacked me, But defending yourself from an attacker doesn't mean that you hate it. So these sorts of ideas, this equation of ignorance causes fear, and fear causes hatred, and hatred causes violence, none of it makes any sense. Except for maybe the end where hatred leads to violence. I think that might be true. As I said, when you hate something, you typically want to attack it. You typically want to destroy it. And that part is true. But none of the other factors leading up to it have any causal relationship whatsoever. So, why is this appealing? If you take 2 seconds to think about something like this, it all falls apart. None of it makes any sense. There's no causal relationship between a lack of knowledge, ignorance, fear, and hatred. Why do people get so attached to this idea? Why does it, for a lot of people who don't think about these issues, as soon as they hear an explanation like this, they have like a sense of, wow, this makes so much sense. I agree with this. Doesn't this make perfect sense? These racists are just ignorant. If only they had the knowledge. Which, by the way, just for another quick aside, the fact is that the people who are most anti-racist are typically the people who have had no experience with communities of other races. It's typically the white people who are the most anti-racist are the ones who live in majority white areas, where the only experience that they have with other races are the rare minority in the community that has been forced essentially through social pressures to adopt or attempt to adopt the predominantly white culture and manners of the whites in that area. So it's typically the people who are the most ignorant that are the most anti-racist. And it's the people who, like myself, who have had tremendous experience with other races, who have a more realistic understanding of the differences between the races. And I'm not saying that I hate other races, but I have a very clear understanding of how different communities of races, different racial communities, have very different cultures, have very different ways of life, different manners, different expressions, fundamentally different ways of life. And I don't want the white European way of life to go extinct, because it will go extinct with the extinction of white people. The more white people have their countries dispossessed by other races, with this mass migration of other races into white countries, the more white people and their way of life will disappear. And it is only white people who are cloistered in the system that we're living under today, that is controlled by a certain parasitic element. It is only those white people who lack the knowledge of how other races really behave when a community is predominantly an other race. Only they can have this outlandish opinion that all races are equal and that it's just skin color and racial differences are very superficial, everyone is interchangeable. It's only those types of white people. And also children. One of the arguments that people give to try to support this idea is, children all get along with each other. When a child is introduced to a person of another race, they don't see color. They don't see the racial differences. They treat all other children equally. Well, most children are completely ignorant of what it means to have a way of life, to have a culture, to be of a racial group. And as they grow and mature and develop their worldview and develop their instincts, develop their customs, their culture, that is when they start to acquire this knowledge. So children not being racist or having no perspective on race is really an argument that ignorance leads to anti-racism, or ignorance does not lead to racism. And yet it's very often these people will say stuff like, oh, children aren't racist. You aren't born racist, therefore it makes no sense. So once again, coming back to the first issue, why does this appeal to people? Why is this so appealing to so many people? And why is it so frequently repeated? Well, this goes back, like I said, to Plato. And Plato, I'm not saying that Plato caused this, but I'm saying that the impulse to this type of a position is something that's very old. And I think it appeals to two types of people, mainly. And not just these people, but I think I can explain why it appeals to two types of people. The first type of person is the highly educated, universalist, cosmopolitan fool who has been just drowned in knowledge and facts and learning from year one all the way up through college and graduate and postdoc and all that shit. Just drowned in knowledge, and they have this sense, because they have spent so much time in their life devoting themselves to gathering knowledge, that this knowledge must mean that they have some kind of insight as to what is good and bad in the world. And because they have so much knowledge, it is this knowledge that necessarily leads to correct moral opinions. And having this correct moral opinion and basing it on the main thing that they've devoted their life to is something that is incredibly important to them. They are emotionally invested in the idea that they have the right worldview, the right opinions on things, and that the knowledge is what led them to this. And that if anyone disagrees, it must just mean that they lack knowledge, that they lack the same knowledge that they have acquired. And it's just emotionally incredibly important to them to feel as if their knowledge gives them this privileged point of view in the world, and that they now have the right to dictate what's good and bad to other people. And that anyone disagreeing, like I said, must have just missed out on the acquisition of this knowledge. There's no possible way that they can have a different opinion that is in any way valid or justified. And on the other side, you have the common folks that this sort of thing that this sort of explanation appeals to. The common folks, I think, also have an emotional attachment to what's prevailing, the prevalent opinions of society, the authoritative opinions in society. And in general, it is the common people who, instead of having a superabundance of knowledge and learning, actually have a lack of knowledge and learning. So when they hear from some supposed authority figure, like the people standing in front of them on a TED Talk, or the people like Ibn Rushd, these philosophers, or Yoda in Star Wars, when these common people who are truly ignorant, truly lack knowledge in general, hear from a perceived expert or authority figure that this is the case, it gives like an emperor's new clothes effect, where they don't want to be ignorant. They don't want to be perceived as ignorant. So, as soon as someone says, this bad thing is caused by ignorance, they instantly have this reaction of, well, I don't want to be perceived as bad or ignorant, so I'm just going to nod my head, pretend that I have this supposed knowledge that is required to be good. And all it takes from them is just agreeing with the experts, agreeing with the authorities, and they get to feel both knowledgeable and good. So it's a very appealing thing for the type of person who never really thinks about issues like this. They get to feel both good and smart just by agreeing with this argument. It's magical. It's really a great enchantment to put on a person. So, that's all I have to say about this. Thank you for watching.